authentication. Passwords have been around since the dawn of time. And it's an age-old question: how do you keep them secure? How do you stop bad actors from guessing your password, breaking into systems, doing things they shouldn't be doing? And if you don't work somewhere that has password security policies, you need to ask why, because these things are important. People come up with lots of different ways of trying to make systems secure, using complex passwords, multi-factor authentication, on-time login codes, only allowing logins from trusted devices. More recently, mobile apps, biometric authentication using a fingerprint, using Face ID. Who's tried putting a face mask on someone else's face and fooling Face ID? Exactly. Password managers, because as you have more and more complex passwords, you're never going to remember them all. So, all of these things are tools which we try to keep our infrastructure secure. You've also got key pair authentication, SSH. Uses cryptographic keys, long 128-bit, 248-bit keys, which are not easy to remember, but they're files, and those files still need to be managed. They need to be expired and rotated, and it's still a headache which we don't really have good answers to. There is one other thing. OpenSSH does also support authenticating using certificates. I'll come back to this in a minute. The certificates, as we saw earlier, can have expiry dates on them. And there's a nice little trick where you can issue a certificate with an expiry date of maybe 2 hours. After that 2 hours, you're no longer authenticated. I'll leave you thinking about that one. But then, that still leaves us with another problem. It's fine for users to have passwords and to remember passwords, or to use password managers to authenticate into systems. But what happens with automation, with build pipelines, with your Ansible scripts, with Chef, Puppet? Well, you have password stores which can be cracked. Some systems allow you to use an API key or a token instead of a password, which is still a password. You still have to securely lock it away somewhere. If you're in a cloud, maybe you could use Trusted Profile. If you're on an AWS instance, you've got instance profiles. Those instance profiles can be associated with IAM roles. We can get permissions that way. That kind of works. Trusted identity providers. We're all familiar with using the likes of Google or Azure AD to authenticate themselves. How about authenticating your build pipelines? And this is a fairly new trend that's been kicking off recently, using OpenID Connect, or OIDC for short, to actually authenticate with cloud services. So we're used to using identity access systems to authenticate users, where an app will trust Google, or an app will trust Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever your favoured identity management is. Why can't we do the same thing for machine-to-machine authentication? Well, you can. More and more systems, GitHub, GitLab, a number of other ones, are starting to run their own internal OIDC service. You configure your cloud to trust that OIDC service, just in the same way that your applications trust the authenticating service. And then when each pipeline job runs, it's issued a jobs token, or JWT token. Then your cloud provider can validate that and grant the permissions needed. So if you go online, Google, GitHub Actions, got a lot of documentation. Again, apologise for the resolution. You can't see what it says, but down the side there, you've got Azure, you've got AWS, you've got Google Cloud. There's If you go and look on GitHub's documentation, it tells you how you can configure each of those cloud services to trust GitHub's identity provider and to then allow you to authenticate and assume the necessary permissions. Similarly on GitLab. Again, down the side here you can't read it, but it's a list of all of your typical cloud providers. And even for things like Terraform Cloud, they haven't updated the documentation yet, but there are some smart people like this Ned in the Cloud who's published YouTube videos on how to even get Terraform Cloud to do the same thing. Terraform provides a NoIDC service which you can then use to authenticate with. So, what does that look like? So this is fortunately you can read this. This is a GitHub Actions pipeline. You've got this line here, where you say configure with AWS credentials. You give it an IAM role. The session name is just optional. The key thing here is the IAM role. In the background, GitHub is issuing the JWT token. You've previously already configured your cloud, your AWS account, to trust GitHub's provider. And then you just use the standard AWS command lines or any other tool that uses the standard AWS environment variables for your credential authentication. Same thing for GitLab. This is a little bit more transparent than the GitHub Actions option, where you can see it's actually doing an STS assume role with web identity and passing through the token, the JWT token. Terraform. Here you go. This is the magic environment variable, which they haven't documented yet. If you pull that environment variable in, you can use that to do Terraform's assume role with web identity. All of this means that you don't need to say anywhere in GitLab, in GitHub, anywhere else, any form of access key ID, passwords, secrets, anything like that. All you need to know is what role you want to assume, and then behind the scenes, everything else just works. And it's awesome. But what about other services? What if you want to authenticate to Kubernetes or to a database or even SSH services if you need to use an SFTP transfer, something like that, or even just other REST APIs. There is another way. Who has heard of Teleport before? There's a couple of hands. You don't count at the back. So, full disclaimer, I'm not getting paid by Teleport. I'm not a salesman for Teleport. I am a big fan though. I've been using Teleport since probably version 3, and they've just released version 12 in the last week or two. Teleport, you remember I mentioned OpenSSH allows you to authenticate with certificates. Teleport grew out of that. It provides a framework to maintain its own certificate authority, to authenticate with an identity provider of your choice. Could be Azure AD, could be GitHub OAuth, could be another OpenID Connect provider if you use Keycloak or any of those other tools. And it will issue a certificate. It will issue a certificate based on access control lists and role-based access. And it will include everything that your user is allowed to access. And it will send a certificate to you. Not only that, it will also work with machines. It's smart. So you can use the same method to authenticate users, engineers logging in from their laptops, from completely remote locations, or through build pipelines, through a Jenkins pipeline, through GitHub Actions. And it doesn't matter whether you're using Kubernetes, database access, SSH access through to back-end systems. It's just a really neat way of working. It also supports role elevation. And there's integrations with things like Slack, Jira, PagerDuty, which allow you to request raised access. So a normal engineer wouldn't have access, for example, to a production system, but if you need to access production for an instant, you can request access. You'll send a message to a Slack channel or to PagerDuty, and when someone responds to approve that request, then your access levels get elevated and gives you a new certificate with the additional permissions that your user has access to. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to now spend whatever time I've got left. I've stopped running my timer, so I'll wait for someone at the back to wave at me that they're getting desperate, they want to go and get their drinks upstairs. I'm just going to give you a quick demo of Teleport, some of the functions and features. I haven't done any of this just-in-time access, I'll just put it out there, but it's there, it works. And let's show you what it can do. So first off, I'm only running, it's in two flavours. You can use it for free, open source software. You can also pay for support. And when you pay for the support, you get extra functionality. In the open source version, the only identity provider it supports is GitHub. If you pay for the enterprise version, like I mentioned, you can use Azure AD, any other OpenID Connect, SAML provider, whatever. So this is the open source version. It's configured to use GitHub authentication. I'm already logged into GitHub on this machine, so when I click on GitHub, it's just going to take me straight in. If I wasn't logged in, then whatever my GitHub account's configured with, password, two-factor authentication, it will go through the normal GitHub login prompt. And so you've got the web interface. At the moment, I've only got one server registered here. You can use it to reverse proxy through to applications. So anything which isn't directly exposed to the internet, like my pfSense router at home. Kubernetes clusters. You can use it to provide remote access to Kubernetes clusters that you wouldn't normally access. Databases. I've got an Aurora cluster running in a VPC, private subnets, not accessible from the internet. I'll show you that even on this public Wi-Fi, I can get access to it. It does also support Windows Remote Desktop. I haven't got one of those set up today, sorry. Servers, too wide a window to see on the screen. There is actually a web-based terminal session, and you can actually log in through a web browser and actually run your sessions from wherever you can get to it from a browser. This is actually a VM running on my NAS at home. I can get to it, I can run stuff from here. It's neat. Not only that, but it's fully audited. And it records the sessions. You can then play back the sessions, so your security people are happy as well. So if I whiz down to active sessions, I can see I've got a session in progress. I could join and observe what's going on in that session. Or even if I close that session down, if this is smart, let me just kill that. Log out. You can replay that session too. I go to the Management tab, Session Recordings. There's my session I've just had. I can play it back, and you can see what someone was doing. Security people love this feature. And you can fast forward it and go through it. Great. So that's as a user through a web browser. What about from terminal? So let me just go to this. There's a command line client called TSH. Love demo. I need 2 hands to type. it opens a web browser to use your GitHub authentication. Let's close that down. And back over here. So from the command line, it's now noticed I'm logged in. It can see what roles I've been given, and various permissions. One thing I forgot to mention, I'll show this because I like this. As well as the applications, you can use it as a federation identity manager to log into Amazon as well. So I can say I want to log in with an assumed role power user. It will log me into an Amazon console. Great if you don't want to have a whole bunch of IAM users, but you just want to control access to your dev community. You see here, it's told me that I'm logged in as federated user, teleport user, logCAD. That's really powerful. Great if you've got a large dev team but you don't want to have to manage IAM accounts and stuff. Anyway, back over here. There's my Kubernetes cluster. I can log into it. I can use it to gain access. That's running in my AWS account. So what that's done is now updated my kubeconfig file with a new entry, changed the context of my kubeconfig file, and I can just use standard kubectl commands. And that will now connect via the teleport proxy, give me direct access to my Kubernetes environment. But I can do more. I can look at my database. Because I've given it permissions with an Amazon, it actually auto-discovers any Aurora databases that you're running. I haven't had to configure this, it's just auto-detected that I've got an Aurora DB instance. Oops. What will it roll? I've missed the hyphen out. So that's now connected me to the database, and I can either tunnel through to port 3306, which allows me to use any desktop tool I want and connect to it, or if I use this command, it drops me straight into a MySQL client. Help my type. There we go. So from my local machine, I can access my database. Awesome. But what about from a pipeline? Here's one I prepared earlier. No, it's going to be another live demo. Promise. So I've got my GitHub Actions pipeline here. I've got two jobs defined in it. One which is going to demo SSH access, and I'm going to connect to my VM that's running in my home NAS and run a couple of commands. And I'm also going to connect to that Kubernetes cluster, and I'm going to just do get pods. And you'll notice at no point in here am I actually passing any credentials through. It's using a token name, GitHub token, and in the back end, that token is specifically associated with a repository, and it will only authenticate if I'm connecting from a pipeline running in that repository. And that's how the authentication works. So if I now go to my GitHub, and I go to Actions, This is where I keep my fingers crossed that it's going to work. Last time it worked. Run the workflow. I'll wait a minute for GitHub to kick into action. It's going to work. Live demos, they love them. I'm just going to do a refresh in case my screen hasn't refreshed. Oh, here we go, it's now running. I've got 2 jobs running. I've got my SSH access job. So, if I expand this, it's just getting ahead of me. So you can see here, it is successfully connecting to my teleport instance. It's issued a certificate. We can see that it's got a 1-hour expiry. So even if that GitHub instance gets hacked, it's only going to be valid for another hour. And then it proceeds to run some things like uptime and get my CPU. So that's running against a VM at home. I'll look at Kubernetes one. Similarly, it is putting in kubectl binaries, it's putting in the teleport binaries, getting my credentials, and then here it's again setting up a kubectl file. Sorry, the kubeconfig file, which then allows you to use a standard kubectl command, and there's all the pods. I think that's a pretty successful demo. So let me just switch back to the slides. Come on. No, the demo lets me down. So let's just leave the links page up there. That's the last bit of the demo. All of these links, again, like I said, if you want to go onto my GitHub repository, the Tech Talks repository, I've put all of these links there, or you can just Google them yourself. Any questions? I'll hand it back behind on. I'll come back to you afterwards.
Rob, I'm wondering what's your thoughts about Okta to access the different services in a stack or in a company, because they have some kind of the promises like teleport. Just wondering if you compare the teleport and Okta in your knowledge, can you say like teleport can be replace Okta as well?
I believe it's a very similar setup. I've not used Okta. I've spoken to people that have used it. I believe the way it works is very similar. Okta itself is an identity provider. You can use it with Teleport as the identity provider to do the initial authentication. In terms of what it offers in terms of connecting to services that are in DMZs or private subnets, I can't say I've used it, I can't talk about it authoritatively, but my understanding is it's a similar solution to Teleport.
Yeah, just Okta annoying me such a long time, so that's what I'd like to know.
This Teleport was built by developers, by engineers, for engineers, so it's been made easy to use for the likes of you and me. Ola, you had a question?
You trust GitHub?
Do I trust GitHub? I trusted it more before Microsoft bought it. It's had a lot of outages recently as well, which it's not been so reliable. I'm actually using GitHub Actions on Uptime Labs, is one of the little sidelines I consult with. But we've actually started running our own runners rather than using the GitHub hosted runners. Just because...
Even though it's flaky, but I was more asking about security perspective. Do you actually trust it, not like rely on it?
Well, using this, we're not storing any credentials there. So it doesn't matter.
Your IDs is still coming from GitHub, right? So what if that gets messed up?
Well, the way that I set up the system, it only trusts if it's coming from a very specific repository. So that needs to be running the GitHub Actions from within that tech tools repository for it to authenticate and be granted the certificate with the authentication. It's the whole trustless society. Any other questions?